The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Kate Middleton stood in the grand hallway, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the small silver locket around her neck. The palace, usually bustling with staff and security, felt unusually quiet today. Even the familiar sounds of London traffic seemed muted, as if the world itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. William had been in his study since dawn, poring over documents that would change everything. The heavy oak door remained closed, but Kate could see the warm glow of lamplight seeping through the gap at the bottom. She knew he was struggling with the decision that had been weighing on both of them for months. The royal duties, the constant scrutiny, the pressure to maintain a perfect facade, it had all become too much. Their love story had begun like a fairy tale at St. Andrew's University, where two young people fell in love without the weight of crowns and expectations. They had laughed together in lecture halls, shared quiet moments in the library, and dreamed of a future that seemed simple and beautiful. But fairy tales, Kate had learned, don't prepare you for the reality of royal life. The children were still asleep upstairs, George, Charlotte, and Louis, blissfully unaware that their parents' world was about to shift dramatically. Kate had checked on them twice already this morning, memorizing the peaceful expressions on their faces. The way Charlotte's hair spread across her pillow like golden silk. How Louis clutched his favorite stuffed animal even in sleep. She walked slowly toward the study, her heels clicking softly on the floor. Each step felt heavy with the weight of unspoken words and difficult decisions. The portrait of Queen Elizabeth II gazed down from the wall, her eyes seeming to follow Kate's movement with a mixture of understanding and sadness. The late Queen had always been supportive of their marriage, but even she had warned them about the sacrifices royal life would demand. Kate paused at the study door, her hand hovering over the brass handle. Through the thick wood, she could hear the faint sound of papers rustling, and occasionally a deep sigh from William. She knew he was reading the same letter for the third time, the one that would formally request a temporary stepping back from senior royal duties. It wasn't abdication, but it was close enough to feel like the end of everything they had known. The decision hadn't come easily. Months of private discussions, tears shed in the darkness of their bedroom, and countless moments of doubt had led to this morning. The breaking point had come during their last official engagement when Charlotte had asked why Mommy looked so sad in all the newspaper photos. The innocent question had shattered something inside Kate, making her realize that their children were beginning to see the cracks in their carefully constructed public image. William's mental health had been deteriorating too, though he tried to hide it behind his dutiful smile and perfectly pressed uniforms. Kate had noticed the sleepless nights, the way his hands would shake slightly before public appearances, and how he would sometimes stare out the window for hours, lost in thoughts he couldn't share with anyone, not even her. The media attention had become suffocating. Every gesture was analyzed, every expression photographed and dissected. Their private moments had become public property, and their children's childhood was being documented and criticized by people who had never met them. The pressure to be perfect, to never show weakness or genuine emotion, had slowly eroded the foundation of their relationship. Kate finally turned the handle and stepped into the study. William looked up from his desk, his blue eyes reflecting the same mixture of pain and determination that had been there for weeks. The morning light streaming through the window behind him created a halo effect around his hair, making him look both regal and vulnerable at the same time. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed inadequate for such a momentous day, but they were all she could manage without breaking down completely. William stood slowly, setting aside the documents that would change their lives. "Good morning, darling," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of everything they couldn't say out loud. The endearment, which had once filled her with joy, now sounded like a goodbye. They stood facing each other across the room, both knowing that once they took the next step there would be no going back. The silence stretched between them, filled with 20 years of shared memories, dreams that would never be realized, and a love that had survived everything except the crushing weight of royal expectations. Kate noticed how tired William looked despite his attempt to maintain his composure. The lines around his eyes had deepened over the past year, and his shoulders carried a tension that seemed permanent. She wanted to reach out and smooth away the worry lines on his forehead, to tell him that everything would be okay. But she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "The children will be awake soon," she said, glancing toward the ceiling where their bedrooms were located. The thought of explaining this decision to George, Charlotte, and Louis made her heart ache. How do you tell children that their entire world is about to change because their parents need to choose between duty and happiness? William nodded, understanding the urgency in her voice. They had agreed to tell the children together, to present a united front even as their world was falling apart. The letter would be sent to Buckingham Palace by noon, and by evening the entire world would know that the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge were taking an indefinite leave from royal duties. As Kate looked at her husband, she realized that this wasn't just about stepping away from royal life. It was about rediscovering who they were beneath the titles and expectations. They had been Kate and William before they became the Duke and Duchess, and perhaps, if they were brave enough to take this leap, they could be Kate and William again. The soft patter of little feet on the corridor outside broke the heavy silence in the study. Kate and William exchanged a meaningful glance. Charlotte was always the first to wake up, her internal clock as reliable as any alarm. They could hear her gentle humming as she made her way down the hall, probably checking on her younger brother Louis before heading to their parents' room. William closed the leather folder containing their future, his fingers lingering on the royal seal, one last time. In a few hours that seal would represent a life they were walking away from, but for now, it still held the weight of duty and tradition. He moved toward Kate, and for the first time in weeks, the distance between them felt bridgeable. "We should go to them," Kate said, smoothing down her simple blue dress, a far cry from the elaborate outfits she wore for official engagements. Today, she had chosen comfort over protocol, already beginning to shed the layers of royal expectation that had wrapped around her like chains. They left the study together, their shoulders almost touching but not quite. In the hallway they found Charlotte peering into Louis's room, her small hand on the doorframe. At 6 years old, she had developed a protective instinct toward her little brother that reminded Kate so much of William's own relationship with Harry in their childhood. "Mummy, Daddy!" Charlotte's face lit up when she saw them, and she ran toward them with the uninhibited joy that only children possess. William scooped her up, spinning her around once before holding her close. Kate watched the interaction with a mixture of love and heartbreak. These simple family moments were what they were fighting to preserve. George appeared in his doorway, already dressed but with his hair sticking up in several directions. At 9, he was beginning to understand the weight of his future role, though his parents had tried to shield him from too much too soon. His serious expression reminded Kate of William at that age, carrying responsibilities that seemed too heavy for such young shoulders. "Can we have breakfast in the garden today?" Charlotte asked, still nestled in William's arms. "The roses are blooming, and I want to pick some for Mummy." Kate's throat tightened. Such a simple request, but it highlighted everything they were about to give up and everything they hoped to gain. Royal breakfast was usually a formal affair, eaten in the dining room with proper place settings and careful conversation. But in their new life, they could eat wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. "That sounds perfect, sweetheart," Kate managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Go wake up Louis and we'll meet you downstairs." As the children scampered off, chattering excitedly about their garden breakfast, Kate and William found themselves alone again. The sounds of their children's joy echoed through the halls, a stark contrast to the solemnity of their morning decision. "They're so happy," William said quietly, watching his children disappear around the corner. "When was the last time we were that carefree?" Kate thought back to their university days, to lazy Sunday mornings when their biggest worry was finishing an essay or making it to the pub before it closed. Those memories felt like they belonged to different people, younger, more optimistic versions of themselves who believed love could conquer anything. The breakfast in the garden was unlike any meal they had shared in months. Sitting on a checkered blanket under the oak tree, with Louis giggling as he chased butterflies and Charlotte weaving dandelions into a crown, Kate felt a glimpse of what their life could become. William was teaching George how to skip stones in the small pond, both of them laughing when the stones sank immediately. For 2 hours they were just a family. No photographers hidden in the bushes, no security briefings, no schedules dictated by protocol officers. Kate found herself truly laughing for the first time in weeks when Lewis insisted on feeding strawberries to his father, missing William's mouth entirely and hitting his nose instead. But even in these precious moments, the weight of their decision pressed at the edges of their consciousness. Kate noticed how William's smile would fade when he thought no one was looking, and she caught herself memorizing every detail of the garden, knowing it might be the last time they would all be together here like this. As the morning wore on, the children's energy began to flag. Louis curled up in Kate's lap, his thumb finding its way to his mouth as he grew drowsy. Charlotte and George had begun a quiet game with their toy cars, their voices a soft murmur in the warm air. "We need to tell them," William said quietly, his voice barely audible over the children's play. "Before the letter goes out." Kate nodded, her hand automatically smoothing Louis's hair. She had been rehearsing different ways to explain their decision, but every version seemed inadequate. How do you tell children that their entire world is changing because their parents can no longer bear the weight of being perfect? "Children," Kate called softly, gathering courage from somewhere deep inside. "Come sit with Daddy and me. We have something important to tell you." George and Charlotte exchanged glances. They had inherited their parents' intuition and could sense when something significant was happening. They moved closer, Charlotte automatically reaching for George's hand in a gesture that made Kate's heart clench. William cleared his throat, looking at each of his children in turn. "You know how Daddy and Mummy have been very busy lately with royal duties," he began, his voice carefully controlled. George nodded solemnly. "You're always going to meetings and wearing fancy clothes for pictures." "That's right," Kate continued, shifting Louis slightly so she could see all three of their faces. "Well, Daddy and Mummy have decided that we need to take a break from all of that. We want to spend more time being a family, just the 5 of us." Charlotte's brow furrowed in the way it did when she was processing complex information. "Does that mean we don't have to go to boring events anymore?" Despite the gravity of the situation, William chuckled. "No more boring events for a while, sweetheart." "But what about being prince and princess?" George asked, his young mind trying to grasp concepts that even adults found difficult. Kate and William had prepared for this question, but hearing it from their son's lips made it feel more real and more heartbreaking. "You'll always be prince and princess," Kate assured him. "But sometimes even princes and princesses need to take breaks to remember what makes them happy." Louis, who had been quietly listening despite his sleepy state, looked up at his mother with wide eyes. "Are we going to live somewhere else?" The innocent question hung in the air like a physical weight. They hadn't yet decided where they would go or what their new life would look like, but they knew it wouldn't be here, surrounded by the golden cage of royal protocol and expectations. The question about where they would live lingered in the garden air like morning mist. Kate looked at William, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. They had discussed possibilities in whispered conversations late at night, but nothing felt concrete yet. The cottage in Norfolk where they had spent their happiest years seemed like a distant dream, though it was less than 2 hours away. "We might go to Anmer Hall," William said carefully, referring to their country home that had always felt more like a sanctuary than a royal residence. "Would you like that? Remember how much fun we had there last summer?" Charlotte's eyes brightened. "Immediately. With the big garden where we can run without anyone taking pictures?" "Exactly like that," Kate confirmed, feeling a small spark of hope ignite in her chest. Anmer Hall represented freedom in a way that nowhere else could. There they had picnics without protocol officers timing every bite, and the children could play without security guards measuring safe distances. George, ever the thoughtful one, tilted his head with concern. "But what about great-grandmama? Won't she be sad if we're not here to help with royal things?" Kate's heart squeezed at the mention of Queen Elizabeth II. The late queen had passed away 2 years earlier, but George still sometimes spoke of her as if she might walk through the palace doors at any moment. His question revealed how much He had absorbed about duty and family responsibility, despite their efforts to let him be just a child. Great-grandmama always wanted us to be happy, William said gently, his voice thick with emotion. She told me once that the most important thing was to take care of our family first. She would understand what we're doing. Louis had fallen asleep in Kate's arms, his small body completely relaxed against her. Looking down at her youngest child, Kate felt the fierce protection that had been building inside her for months. He was only 3. He deserved to grow up knowing his parents as people, not just as titles in the newspaper. The morning sun was climbing higher, and Kate knew they couldn't delay much longer. The letter to Buckingham Palace needed to be sent, and once it was, there would be no taking it back. Phone calls would need to be made to family members, staff would need to be informed, and the careful machinery of royal communication would spring into action. "Why don't you 3 go play by the pond for a few more minutes while Mummy and Daddy take care of some grown-up things?" William suggested, his tone light despite the weight of what they were about to do. Charlotte and George exchanged one of their meaningful looks. They were becoming experts at reading their parents' moods. But they obediently gathered up their toys and headed toward the water, George taking Charlotte's hand with the automatic protectiveness of a big brother. Kate shifted the sleeping Louis to one arm and reached for William's hand with the other. His fingers were cold despite the warm morning, and she could feel the slight tremor that had become more frequent over the past few weeks. The pressure of their decision was taking a physical toll on both of them. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked, voicing the question that had kept her awake every night for the past month. William was quiet for a long moment, watching their older children chase a butterfly near the pond. "I don't know if it's right," he said finally, "but I know we can't keep going the way we were. Last week, when Charlotte asked why we always look sad in pictures, I realized she was learning that happiness wasn't normal for us." Kate remembered that conversation. Charlotte had been looking through a magazine at the dentist's office, pointing to a photo of Kate and William at a charity gala. "Why don't you smile with your eyes, Mummy?" she had asked with the brutal honesty of childhood. The observation had haunted Kate for days. She had practiced genuine smiles in the mirror, trying to remember what authentic joy felt like on her face. The fact that her 6-year-old daughter could see through their carefully constructed public personas had been a wake-up call that couldn't be ignored. "I keep thinking about your mother," Kate said softly. "How she fought to give you and Harry as normal a childhood as possible. Maybe this is our way of doing the same thing for our children." William's jaw tightened at the mention of Princess Diana. His mother's death had shaped every decision he made about public life and family protection. The paparazzi that had hunted her so relentlessly were still there, still hungry for any glimpse into their private lives. "Mom would have understood," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She always said that being a good parent was more important than being a good royal." They sat in comfortable silence watching their children play. Louis stirred in Kate's arms, mumbling something in his sleep that sounded like "Daddy," such a simple word, but it carried the weight of everything William was trying to preserve by making this difficult choice. A staff member appeared at the garden door, discreetly holding an envelope. Kate's stomach dropped. It was time. The letter had been typed, sealed, and was ready for its journey to Buckingham Palace. Once it was delivered, there would be meetings, press releases, and a media storm that would make their current scrutiny seem gentle by comparison. William stood, slowly, as if his body was reluctant to take the final step. "I'll be right back," he told Kate, leaning down to kiss the top of her head. The gesture was so tender and familiar that it reminded her why they were fighting so hard to preserve their family. As William walked toward the house, Kate found herself memorizing the scene around her. The way the light filtered through the leaves of the oak tree, the sound of Charlotte's laughter mixing with George's more serious commentary, the feeling of Louis's warm weight in her arms. These were the moments that mattered, the ones that made all the difficult decisions worthwhile. She thought about the criticism they would face, the accusations of selfishness and abandonment of duty. The tabloids would have a field day, and social media would buzz with opinions from people who had never faced the pressure of living under constant scrutiny. But sitting here with her children, feeling genuine peace for the first time in months, Kate knew they were making the right choice for their family. When William returned, his face was pale but determined. "It's done," he said simply, settling back down beside her on the blanket. The words hung between them with finality. There was no taking it back now. Their old life was officially over, and their new one was about to begin. Kate felt a mixture of terror and relief wash over her, like stepping off a cliff and discovering she could fly. The afternoon brought an unusual quietness to Kensington Palace, as if the building itself was holding its breath. News of the letter's delivery had spread quickly among the staff, though no official announcement had been made yet. Kate noticed the careful way the household employees moved around them, their expressions a mixture of surprise, concern, and something that looked almost like relief. William had retreated to his study again, but this time Kate joined him. They sat together, on the leather sofa, sharing a silence that felt different from the morning's tension. The decision was made, the letter sent, and now they were in the strange limbo between their old life and whatever came next. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing," William said, glancing at the silent device on his desk. He had turned off the ringer, after the 5th call from Buckingham Palace in 30 minutes. Kate nodded, understanding his reluctance to face the immediate consequences. They would have to speak to King Charles soon, explain their decision to the rest of the royal family, and somehow navigate the media storm that was already brewing. Palace press secretaries were probably crafting carefully worded statements, while photographers positioned themselves outside the palace gates. "I keep waiting to feel guilty," Kate admitted, curling her legs under her on the sofa. "But all I feel is lighter somehow." William looked at her with surprise, then recognition dawned in his eyes. "I feel it too, like I can breathe properly for the first time in years." Through the study window they could see their children still playing in the garden. Charlotte had convinced George to help her build a fairy house out of twigs and leaves, while Louis toddled around collecting flowers for his own mysterious purpose. The scene was so perfectly normal, so wonderfully ordinary that it reinforced their conviction that they had made the right choice. "Mummy, Daddy," Charlotte's voice carried across the garden. "Come see what we made." Kate and William exchanged a smile, their first genuinely happy expression in weeks. In their old life, such an interruption would have been impossible. Royal schedules were planned to the minute, leaving little room for spontaneous fairy house inspections or flower collecting expeditions. They made their way back to the garden, where Charlotte proudly displayed an elaborate construction of sticks, leaves, and some of Kate's good ribbon that had somehow made its way outside. George stood beside it, looking slightly embarrassed but pleased, while Louis held out a handful of dandelions with dirt still clinging to the roots. "It's beautiful," Kate said, meaning every word. "The fairies will love living here." "George says fairies aren't real," Charlotte said with the dramatic indignation of a 6-year-old. "But I told him that just because we can't see them doesn't mean they're not there." William crouched down to examine the fairy house more closely, and Kate saw something in his expression that had been missing for months, genuine engagement with his children's world. "I think Charlotte might be right," he said conspiratorially. "Some of the most important things are invisible." The comment carried weight beyond fairy house construction, and Kate felt her throat tighten with emotion. Love, hope, family bonds, all the invisible things they were fighting to protect with their dramatic life change. As the afternoon wore on, they found themselves creating new routines without even realizing it. Tea was served in the garden, instead of the formal dining room. The children's bath time became a splashing, laughing affair without the pressure of maintaining proper behavior for staff who might overhear. Bedtime stories were longer, with more voices and sound effects than protocol usually allowed. But as night fell, reality crept back in. Phone calls would need to be returned. Conversations would need to be had, and tomorrow would bring the full weight of their decision crashing down on them. Kate stood at Charlotte's bedroom window, watching the lights of London twinkle in the distance, knowing that somewhere out there, news outlets were preparing headlines about their choice. "Will they understand?" she asked William as they stood, together in the hallway after tucking in all 3 children. Some will, he said thoughtfully. Others won't. But understanding isn't really the point anymore, is it? We can't live our lives based on what other people think we should do. Kate nodded, but she couldn't quite shake the anxiety about public reaction. For over a decade, she had been the Duchess of Cambridge, beloved by many for her grace under pressure and dedication to duty. Tomorrow she might be seen as selfish, as someone who had abandoned her responsibilities when they became inconvenient. They walked to their own bedroom in companionable silence. The room felt different somehow, less like a royal suite and more like a place where two tired parents might actually rest. Kate found herself looking forward to sleep without the anxiety dreams that had plagued her for months. As she changed into her nightgown, Kate caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked the same as always, but something in her eyes was different. The constant tension around them had softened, and for the first time in years, she looked like someone who wasn't carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. William emerged from the bathroom already in his pajamas, simple cotton ones rather than the formal sleepwear that somehow seemed required in their royal life. He looked younger too, Kate realized, as if the decision to step back had erased some of the premature aging that duty had imposed on him. They settled into bed together, and for the first time in months, Kate didn't immediately reach for a book or her phone to distract herself from the day's worries. Instead, she turned toward William, really looking at her husband rather than the Duke of Cambridge. "I love you," she said simply. The words weren't new, but they felt different now, less like a comfort and more like a promise of the future. They were choosing together. "I love you too," he replied, reaching out to stroke her cheek. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Outside their window, London continued its restless hum, unaware that two of its most famous residents had just chosen love over duty, family over obligation, and hope over fear. Tomorrow would bring challenges, criticism, and difficult conversations. But tonight, Kate and William fell asleep as themselves, not as the Duke and Duchess, not as representatives of the crown, but as two people who had decided that their happiness and their children's well-being were worth fighting for. In the darkness, Kate's last thought before sleep was of Charlotte's fairy house, built with such hope and imagination. Perhaps some of the most important things really were invisible, like courage, like the decision to choose authenticity over expectation, like the quiet revolution of two people deciding to put their family first. Dawn broke differently over Kensington Palace on the second day. Kate woke to the unusual sound of William's soft laughter drifting from the children's room down the hall. For the first time in months, she hadn't been jolted awake by anxiety, or the piercing sound of her alarm clock set for an early morning engagement. Instead, she had slept through the night and awakened naturally to the sound of her family being happy. She padded quietly down the hallway in her robe, pausing at the doorway to George's room where she found all four of her loved ones crowded onto the narrow single bed. William was reading from one of George's adventure books, but he was doing all the voices, something he rarely had time for in their scheduled royal life. Charlotte was giggling at his impression of a gruff pirate, while Louis clapped his hands at every sound effect. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so wonderfully normal, that Kate felt tears spring to her eyes. This was what they had been fighting for, these unguarded moments of pure family joy that had been squeezed out of their lives by duty and protocol. "Room for one more?" she asked softly, and immediately found herself pulled into the tangle of arms and legs on the small bed. Charlotte nestled against her side while George leaned his head on her shoulder, and for a few precious minutes the world consisted of nothing but the five of them and a story about brave knights and distant kingdoms. But reality couldn't be held at bay forever. Kate's phone had been buzzing insistently from the bedside table, and Williams was doing the same from his study downstairs. The outside world was demanding answers, explanations, and most importantly, public statements about their unprecedented decision. After breakfast, another garden affair that felt like a small rebellion against royal tradition, Kate and William finally faced the flood of messages waiting for them. Buckingham Palace had issued a brief statement acknowledging their request for leave, but the media was hungry for details, explanations, and access to the couple themselves. 23 interview requests, William said, scrolling through his phone, including 3 American networks and someone from Australia. Kate wasn't surprised. Their story had clearly captured international attention. A modern prince and princess choosing to step away from fairy tale expectations in favor of real-life happiness. It was either romantic or scandalous, depending on one's perspective. We don't have to talk to anyone, she said firmly. Not yet. Let them speculate. William nodded, but Kate could see the weight of expectation settling back on his shoulders. Even in rebellion, he felt responsible for managing public perception and protecting the monarchy's reputation. Old habits of duty died hard, even when you were actively rejecting them. The children, blissfully unaware of the media storm swirling around their decision, had moved on to more pressing concerns. Charlotte was adamant that they needed to pack her art supplies for the move to Anmer Hall, while George worried about whether his bicycle would fit in the car. Louis, with the simple adaptability of a 3-year-old, seemed to think the entire situation was an exciting adventure. "When are we leaving?" George asked over lunch, which Kate had prepared herself. A simple meal of sandwiches and fruit that tasted better than any formal royal dining experience she could remember. "Soon, sweetheart," William replied, though neither he nor Kate had yet figured out the logistics of their departure. Leaving Kensington Palace would require coordination with security teams, staff members who depended on their employment, and various royal officials who would need to approve their temporary residence arrangements. But first, they had one more difficult conversation ahead of them. King Charles had requested a private meeting, and Kate knew that avoiding it would only make their situation more complicated. The king had been supportive of their marriage and understanding of their struggles, but asking to step away from royal duties was unprecedented in modern times. "I'll go alone," William said quietly as they watched the children play in the garden after lunch. "This is my decision as much as yours, but the conversation will be easier one-on-one." Kate wanted to protest, to insist that they face everything, together as they had promised. But she also understood the delicate family dynamics at play. Charles was not just a king to William. He was a father who had his own complicated history with choosing between duty and personal happiness. While William prepared for his meeting at Clarence House, Kate found herself walking through the palace rooms one last time. Each space held memories. Their first official portrait in the drawing room, Charlotte's first steps in the long hallway, the Christmas mornings when the children had raced down the grand staircase in their pajamas. She paused in the nursery that had housed all 3 of her babies. The rocking chair where she had spent countless sleepless nights still sat by the window, and the small bookshelf still held the worn copies of fairy tales she had read until she knew them by heart. This room had been her sanctuary during the overwhelming early days of royal motherhood, and leaving it felt like closing a chapter of her life. But as she stood there, Kate realized she wasn't mourning the loss of this life. She was celebrating the courage to choose a different one. The nursery had been beautiful, but it had also been a golden cage limiting their family's freedom in ways both large and small. Her phone rang, interrupting her reflection. It was William, calling from the car. "How did it go?" she asked immediately, hearing the tension in her own voice. "Better than expected," William said, and Kate could hear relief flooding through the phone line. "He understands, Kate. He said he's been watching us struggle and wondering when we would find the courage to make a change." Kate sank into the rocking chair, feeling a weight lift from her chest that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. King Charles's approval didn't make their decision right or wrong, but his understanding made it feel less like a betrayal of everything the royal family represented. "He wants to see the children before we leave," William continued. "To say goodbye, properly, and to let them know that this doesn't change his love for them or their place in the family." The offer was more generous than Kate had dared hope for. She had feared that stepping back would mean cutting ties, losing the extended family relationships that had given their children such a strong sense of belonging and history. That evening, as they packed the first boxes for their move to Norfolk, Kate found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about the future. They still didn't know exactly what their new life would look like, but for the first time, It felt like it would be theirs to create. Charlotte appeared in the doorway carrying her favorite stuffed rabbit and a small suitcase she had packed herself. "I'm ready to go to our new house," she announced with the confidence of someone who trusted her parents to take care of everything. Looking at her daughter's bright, expectant face, Kate felt the last of her doubts dissolve. They were doing this for Charlotte, for George, for Louis, but also for themselves and for the marriage that had gotten lost somewhere beneath the weight of crowns and expectations. 6 months later, Kate stood in the kitchen of Anmer Hall, watching William chase Louis around the garden while Charlotte and George built an elaborate obstacle course for the family's new puppy. The morning sun streamed through windows that didn't need heavy curtains for privacy, and she could hear her family's laughter without worrying about photographers with long-range lenses capturing their private moments. The transformation had been gradual but profound. In those first weeks after leaving Kensington Palace, they had all struggled with the adjustment. George had asked repeatedly when they were going back to London, and Charlotte had cried for her old bedroom with its princess wallpaper. Even Kate and William had found themselves reaching for schedules that no longer existed, feeling oddly lost without the structure of royal engagements. But slowly, a new rhythm had emerged. William had started working with conservation charities on his own terms, without the pressure of representing the crown at every event. Kate had returned to photography, something she had loved at university but had been forced to abandon as it was considered too informal for a duchess. Their relationship had begun to heal from the strain of years spent performing their marriage in public, rather than living it in private. The children had adapted with the resilience that only children possess. George had discovered a love for football that didn't require security escorts to every match. Charlotte had made friends at the local school who knew her as simply Charlotte, not Princess Charlotte. Louis had learned to walk properly in a garden where he could fall down without protocol officers rushing to assist him. Kate's hands were covered in flour this morning because she was baking Charlotte's birthday cake herself, something that would have been unthinkable in their royal life, where professional chefs handled all food preparation for security reasons. The kitchen smelled like vanilla and happiness, and she could already picture Charlotte's face when she saw the slightly lopsided but made with love creation Kate was attempting. "Mummy!" Charlotte burst through the kitchen door, her cheeks flushed from running. "Daddy says we can have my party in the woods behind the house. Can we really?" Kate smiled at her daughter's excitement. In their old life, Charlotte's birthday, parties had been carefully orchestrated affairs with guest lists approved by palace officials and photographers, documenting every moment. This year she would have a handful of school friends, homemade decorations, and the freedom to get as messy as she wanted. "Of course we can," Kate said, wiping her floury hands on her apron. "We can do whatever makes you happy." The simple statement held profound meaning for both of them. For the first time in Charlotte's life, her birthday would be about her joy rather than public relations opportunities or maintaining royal tradition. William appeared in the doorway, carrying a muddy but grinning Louis. "Someone decided the flower bed needed help," he explained, gesturing to Louis's dirt-covered hands and clothes. In their previous life, such a scene would have caused minor panic among staff members responsible for maintaining William's public image. Now Kate just laughed and reached for a wet cloth, cleaning Louis's face while he babbled happily about helping flowers grow. "The party preparations are coming along nicely," William reported, settling Louis into his high chair. "George has appointed himself head of security for the obstacle course, and I've been demoted to assistant balloon inflator." Kate could see the deep contentment in her husband's eyes, the relaxation in his shoulders that had taken months to develop. The constant tension that had made him look older than his years was gradually fading, replaced by something that looked remarkably like the young man she had fallen in love with at university. Their relationship had required conscious rebuilding. Years of performing as the perfect royal couple had created habits of emotional distance that were hard to break. They had started having actual conversations again, not just coordinating schedules or discussing public appearances, but real talks about their dreams, fears, and hopes for their children's futures. The morning continued with the pleasant chaos of family life. Charlotte insisted on helping with the cake decoration, which resulted in more frosting on the kitchen counter than on the actual cake. George contributed by creating elaborate signs for the party games, his serious approach to event planning, eerily reminiscent of royal protocol officers. Louis mainly provided entertainment by attempting to eat everything within reach. As Kate watched her family work together, she reflected on the criticism they had faced in those first months. The tabloids had been brutal, painting them as selfish and irresponsible. Social media had buzzed with opinions about their abandonment of duty. There had been protests outside Buckingham Palace from people who felt betrayed by their decision. But there had also been an unexpected outpouring of support. Letters had arrived at Anmer Hall from families who understood the pressure of public life, from parents who admired their choice to prioritize their children's well-being, and from young people who saw their decision as a brave rejection of outdated expectations. Most surprisingly, other members of the royal family had quietly expressed envy of their courage. Conversations with cousins and extended family members had revealed how many of them had struggled with similar feelings, but had never felt they had the option to choose differently. The afternoon party was everything Charlotte had dreamed of, and nothing like a royal event. Children ran wild through the woods, playing hide-and-seek among the trees and building fairy houses without any concern for dignity or proper behavior. Kate found herself genuinely laughing as she watched William get thoroughly defeated at musical chairs by a group of 7-year-olds who showed no deference to his former royal status. As the sun began to set, and the last party guests were collected by their parents, Kate and William sat on their back porch watching their exhausted but happy children attempt to teach the puppy to fetch. The scene was beautifully ordinary, wonderfully mundane, and absolutely perfect. "Do you ever regret it?" Kate asked quietly, the question that had been forming in her mind for weeks. William was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. "I regret that it took us so long to have the courage to make the change," he said finally. "I regret the years we spent being unhappy when we could have been living like this. But I don't regret choosing our family over everything else." Kate nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Their decision hadn't been made lightly, and it had come with real costs. Relationships strained, traditions broken, and expectations shattered. But sitting here, watching their children be children and feeling genuinely connected to her husband again, she knew they had chosen correctly. As night fell, and they tucked 3 tired but content children into beds in a house that truly felt like home, Kate realized that their story wasn't really about leaving the royal family. It was about finding themselves again. They had stepped away from being the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge and rediscovered how to be Kate and William, parents and partners who had chosen love over duty and authenticity over performance. Their fairy tale hadn't ended when they left the palace. It had simply become real.